Hi, and welcome to today's Engaging for Missouri webinar. I'm Alice Roach from the Division of Applied Social Sciences at the University of Missouri, and I'll be your host today. With each of these 30-minute webinars, we intend to share research-based insights that leaders like you can apply in your own work to benefit and strengthen the state's agriculture and food system, hospitality sector, and communities. Today, Dr. Ray Massey will speak about carbon markets. Before I invite him to begin, I want to share a few housekeeping items. First, we'll close today with a Q&A session. Those of you who connected today via your computer may submit your questions in the chat screen. If you joined today by phone, then you may email me your questions at roacham@missouri.edu. Second, all attendees are muted and may not start their video. Third, if you encounter any technical problems during today's presentation, then you can let me know by either submitting a comment in the chat screen, or you can send me an email at roacham@missouri.edu, and I'll do my best to help you troubleshoot. And last, we will make a recording of today's presentation available. You can look for an email from Zoom that shares more about where you can access that recording in about a day from now. You can also find an archive of all of our previous Engaging for Missouri webinars on our Division of Applied Social Sciences YouTube channel. So with that, we'll transition to the topic of today's webinar, which is titled Emerging Carbon Markets in Agriculture. Presenting today is Dr. Ray Massey, who is an Extension Professor of Agricultural and Applied Economics. So thank you, Ray, for presenting today. If you could please unmute your microphone and start your video, then we can begin today's presentation.
Well, thank you, Alice. And yes, I'll go ahead and begin. We're short on time, so I'll move forward with the emerging markets in agriculture. And I just wanted to start by kind of giving the overview of what's happening in the U.S. as a whole. So this is from the EPA. They estimate every year how much greenhouse gases are emitted in the U.S. And it shows that about 9% of them are with regard to agriculture. And those top two, enteric fermentation and manure management, actually are methane. And the bottom one, soil management, actually is nitrous oxide. So you'll notice up here that we're talking about CO2 equivalents or CO2es. So everything gets put back into carbon dioxide. But agriculture, for the most part, emits methane and nitrous oxide as opposed to carbon dioxide. But we're still have the opportunity to participate in the greenhouse gas markets on all of those situations. So let's look at what the excitement is in the agricultural area. So this is a study by Farragut and others that looks at what the climate mitigation potential in the near future is in million metric tons, which let me go back up here. Notice that the total emissions per year is, let's just say 6 million or 6 billion metric tons. What we're looking here is we have 300 million metric tons could be sequestered by forest, and then also other forest management would go another 200 million metric tons. So a whole lot of sequestration or capture of carbon dioxide or non-release of carbon dioxide could be done by forest. Most people though in agriculture would consider ourselves down here kind of in this middle portion of ag and grasslands. So we'd avoid grassland conversion, we'd have cover crops, we'd have biochar, alley cropping, cropland management, nutrient management. And just real quick on this, the blue bars say that we could probably do that for $10 per ton of CO2 equivalent. That's kind of interesting because most markets think that we will get up there. Right now, they're at about $7. But most markets or most people think that $10 is something that we will hit, maybe even 20. And so the blue bar says, okay, about 20 million metric tons of CO2 capture or not release could occur in avoided grassland conversion. But for that cheap price, we get almost 100 million metric tons in cover crops. And then after that, it becomes much more expensive. That'd be the orange and the gray. So this is where a lot of people are interested in participating with this agricultural stuff. The real excitement, though, is within forest. That's where the greatest potential for carbon sequestration exists. If we look here, this is the latest data that has been published by the USDA. It is a 2013 graph, but it's for 1 year. What is the greenhouse gas flux due to land use and land use changes? And almost all of this actually is carbon dioxide. So when you come down here to cropland remaining cropland, we're a little over 500,000 metric tons of sequestered carbon just by cropland and the way that we are handling it. We're getting more cropland or more carbon in our soils. If land is converted to cropland from pasture, that emits it. And so we've got 0.15 tons emitted. If grassland remains grassland, again, it should be sequestering carbon, a little less than 500,000 metric tons, about 0.4. And land converted to grassland would actually sequester carbon. When you add that all up, it's looking like about 1 million metric tons of carbon was sequestered in 2013 without any carbon market. And so the question is, could we sequester more if there was a carbon market that actually paid us to do that? And so let's look at what a carbon market might do. What I'm looking at here on this graph is how much CO2 equivalents would be captured with different activities. So I'm going to come down here to cover crops. That's one that has a lot of excitement. And we are looking at the impact of, on 1 acre, we're looking at about 0.75 tons of carbon emissions, or really carbon sequestration at this time, from the use of cover crops. So we're not actually getting a ton of carbon sequestered per acre with cover crops. If we go to no-till, it's right at about 0.6 tons per acre that we could sequester carbon. When we come down here to switch nitrogen source to urea, we're looking at about 0.25 or 1/4 of a ton per acre. And that really wouldn't be actually carbon sequestration. That would be avoided nitrous oxide emission, but it goes to 1/4 of a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. So on a per acre basis, no matter what we're looking at less than 1 ton sequestered is our expectation. Now, different soils will respond differently, different areas of the United States will respond differently, but for the US as a whole, less than a ton of any one of our activities per acre. So how does that excite farmers? So let's just do a quick, easy mathematics to see how that would affect farmers. So I'm actually going to use the switch fertilizer nitrogen source to urea. I could have done the one on cover crops, but it's just easier to do it this way, I think. So if I switch my nitrogen source to urea from anhydrous, I generate 1/4 of a ton of CO2 equivalents per acre. I just make the assumption that urea costs 10 cents a pound more per unit of nitrogen than an anhydrous ammonia. I usually apply 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre for my corn crop. So the switch costs me $15 an acre, or that 150 pounds times 10 cents a pound. But what does that mean per ton of carbon? Each ton of carbon dioxide equivalent costs $60 per ton. That's $15 an acre divided by that 1/4 of a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent per acre. So remember, in one of these earlier slides, we were looking at $10 for some of these activities, the blue, $50 for the orange. What I'm really saying here is this particular one is going to cost me $60 a ton for my CO2 equivalent. Not very many people are expecting this carbon to be selling at $60 a ton anytime soon. In the future, it may. But even then, the question becomes, if the farmer receives $60 a ton for CO2 equivalent, what does the buyer pay? Because it's just like, I can buy corn for $5 a bushel, but then when I buy my corn chips, there's just 10 cents worth of corn in there for $1 worth of corn chips. And the same thing happens when we're selling carbon. There are other costs that need to be accounted for. And so the buyer paying the farmer $60 a ton may actually pay much greater than $60 a ton to get that CO2 equivalent. So there are some challenges because there's so little carbon that can be sequestered or not emitted per acre that it'll be a challenge to make a lot of money off of it. So what I have here is a very busy slide intended to communicate busy and confusing and cluttered. These are people that are in, or organizations that are in the carbon market arena right now. And it is developing, it is moving, so we really don't know what's happening. I'm going to show you some of the things that are happening, but these are just what's happening now. So we are looking at a voluntary carbon market. And by the way, there is a mandated carbon market, a regulated carbon market. That would be like the California Air Quality or Air Reduction Board. There's also RGGI over on the northeast side of the United States. But most of what we're looking at is a voluntary carbon market. The USDA is interested in getting involved in that with a pooled carbon bank that's not yet developed. There are marketplaces for individuals and aggregators. So a marketplace right now would be something like Nori or Indigo. And those are individuals that are aggregators, people that are bringing farmers together to create a carbon, enough carbon to sell. And then there's also verification to make sure that we actually have what we say we are doing. There's the integration of the carbon accounting with other ecosystem or conservation efforts. So the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium is saying, wait a minute, when I do something like cover crops, I may actually be helping both water quality and air quality. And by the way, I may actually be helping biodiversity. So I want to integrate those into a single payment as opposed to having 3 different payments. There are sustainable supply chains, an input supplier to a farmer. For example, we might be looking at Bayer. They're saying, hey, we'll supply these inputs. We're wanting to help you sequester carbon or get carbon credits. A farmer to consumer product, Smithfield might be saying, hey, we're wanting to make sure that our product is environmentally good. So we're going to contract back with farmers before us to have carbon credits. There's the integration of technologies to reduce emissions. So Microsoft is coming up with computer technologies, precision agricultural activities that might be helping reduce emissions. Labeling, for the most part, when we're looking at voluntary carbon markets, it is a labeling issue or a marketing issue where they're putting it on, hey, we are net zero, we are reduced greenhouse gases, something of that nature. Because they really don't have to, but they consider it something worthwhile to put on their website or on their product. And then there is the integration of USDA programs, and there's several different ways in which that's occurring. Crop insurance this year had it. There are other conservation practices. There are bills before Congress right now. And the administration has put forth several different proposals. So the USDA is most likely going to be involved in this as well. Again, the purpose of this slide is to say, this is developing. Everybody has a different idea of how it should develop. And therefore, we really are not sure how it will develop. So the important part is, are you going to be involved in it or let it develop without you? So right now, I just want to say I got most of this stuff, the next couple of slides, from the American Soybean Association website. But it just looks like at some of the highlights of carbon markets where farmers are able to participate right now. And again, the objective of these slides is to say that it is all over the board. So for example, Bayer is paying $3 per acre for reduced tillage and $6 per acre for cover crops. Join those together, they'll give you $9 per acre. And they pay that just because you either did reduced tillage or cover crops. The soil and water outcomes is looking up to $40 per acre for carbon sequestered. Indigo Ag is looking at $10 per ton for a floor. Now, if you are quick, you noticed I changed from per acre to per ton. So it's really per ton of carbon, the carbon dioxide equivalent, that they're looking at Indigo Ag. And so we've got the first top two looking at, hey, I'm just going to pay you by acre. Then we've got the next couple, Indigo Ag and Land of Lake, saying, no, I'm going to pay you by ton. And one of them's 10 and another one's 20. And then Nori comes in and says, okay, I'm going to give you a $15 per CO2 equivalent. It's a credit. And I'm actually going to give you some cryptocurrency called a Nori token that you can't use for 10 years, but might come in handy at some point. And so the prices are different and the units that they're paying on are different. What about the payment basis? There's three broad ways that in which they're paying. They're just looking at process based. You do the activity, you get the credit. That would be Bayer and the Farmers Business Network gradable. Process based, but it's a model based on soil samples. So they would actually go out and measure particular locations and try and make a model as to what your farm might be doing. And that'd be Indigo Ag, Nori, soil and water outcomes. And then there'd be outcome based, which would say, okay, we're actually going to measure and verify the outcome, which would be increased soil organic matter on your farm, which would be Ecosystem Service Market Consortium and Corteva Granular. So even the way in which you will get assigned credits, how many credits you'll get are different, whether it's because you did an activity or because you had a measured outcome. If we looked at contract length, which I think is really quite critical as we're looking at this, there is a 1 year renewable for soil and water outcomes. But if you went to the Farmer Business Gradable Network gradable, it's a 5-year program plus a 5-year additional maintenance. But if you go to Corteva, it's a 10-year contract with a 2-year opt-out clause. So you start it, and after 1 year, you say, I don't want to do this, you can get out. After 2 years, you can get out, but after 3 years, you're in it for 10 years. If you go to Ecosystems Market Consortium or Nori, they're saying, no, this is a 10-year contract. If you go to True Carbon, you're looking at a 20-year contract. If you actually are dealing with forestry activities, which I don't have those up here, but forestry activities are 50 to 100-year contracts. And so all of these contract lengths are different as well. What that means, as far as, in my opinion, for people interested in carbon markets, is you have to ask a lot of questions. And by the way, these are just some of the questions that I've seen others ask and that I've had asked about. But will rented land be treated differently than owned land? If I have a 10-year contract for carbon, can I do that on a 1-year renewable cash lease on my land? Probably not. And so there will be some challenges with land tenure. And I've already mentioned if the buyer pays $40 per ton of carbon, how much will the farmer get? But again, what is that verification, marketing, transaction cost going to be in the carbon market? And then under what, if any, circumstances would I have to return payments received for carbon credits? So example, if in fact you were based on measurement and you did not actually increase your soil organic matter, would you have to return payments that you were paid earlier? And are there force majeure clauses, which means what happens if I was not able to plant the cover crop, but I said I was going to, but it just did not work out? Or what happens if I had compaction and I needed to till up what was supposed to be no-till land? How do I deal with that? Is there a lien that attaches to your property when entering into a carbon contract? Again, you've got a 10-year contract, maybe a 20-year contract. is there some type of lien to where future sales would have to honor that activity? And then finally, what happens if the carbon registry I contract with goes bankrupt? Again, there was a Chicago Climate Exchange, and it ceased operations in 2010. There were still a lot of contracts out when it ceased operations. Essentially, all of those carbon that was in a bank did not have much value. And so what would happen though if they actually went bankrupt, and who would have responsibility for those things? So there's just a ton of questions that need to be asked, and there will be different answers as the markets develop. So real quick, this is my last slide here. Just what are the information sources? So I have written Climate Change in Missouri Agriculture, which is at mitigation.org. I've also written a guide called Agriculture and Greenhouse Gases, which looks at gases, not at carbon markets, which is at extension.missouri.edu. Alejandro Plastina at Iowa State University has written a very good guide on how to grow and sell carbon credits in the US agriculture. And so it has a lot of the things that I've talked about before, is how does each one of these markets deal with different questions. And the American Soybean Association Carbon Market Snapshot at soygrowers.com also has these things of how do the different markets handle payments, contract lengths, and things of that nature. So I would encourage anyone with interest to look at those 4 sources. And at this point, I am going to go ahead and let Alice ask questions from the audience.
Great, Ray. Thank you so much. We do have some time for questions. So if you have a question for Dr. Massey, please include that in the chat screen, or you may send it to me via email at roacham@missouri.edu. Ray, to get started, we do have an attendee question, and she writes, what do credit buyers get from buying carbon credits?
In a voluntary market like we currently have, they get goodwill. So I'll just use Microsoft as an example. Microsoft has made a commitment that by 2030, they will be carbon neutral. And they recognize that they cannot get their emissions of carbons down to 0. So the only way they can be carbon neutral is to pay somebody else to sequester carbon or to remove carbon from the air. And they get goodwill from being carbon neutral. In a mandated market, which we have not yet had in the United States, some emitters would perhaps have to buy carbon sequestration, carbon credits, because they cannot meet their cap that has been specified by government. That would currently only be for California or RGGI.
Great, thank you. So is Microsoft buying the credits generated by agriculture, and are there other examples of firms doing that?
You know, I do not know if Microsoft is buying those from agriculture, but they are buying credits. I just don't know who they're buying it from. And there are quite a few firms that are buying credits from agriculture right now. So if it's really the marketplace, like let me just take Nori. Nori would be an aggregator that would buy it from an individual farmer and then find somebody else like a food processor who wants to be able to put a label on their food that says, hey, we've reduced carbon emissions by this much. And they would purchase it from Nori. So Nori is that intermediate platform.
Great, thank you. Another question here is, will markets be set up to give farmers credit for practices already used, and how far back would that go?
That's a great question. And I could have had that on some of my examples, because some of them currently do allow you to go back. Some of them will not allow you to go back. What I'd really like to say, though, is if you're talking to a person who truly is worried about carbon in the environment, they say no, for sure no. What they're interested in is reduction into the future, not reduction into the past. And so if the rules are made by those who are only interested in how much carbon is in the environment? No. And that would probably be a regulated market. In the voluntary market, there really is no definition of what is happening. So a company can say, yes, I bought it from a guy who sequestered it 3 years ago, and I'm taking it as credit for today, because it's all voluntary. And so in some ways, when you see the label on different products that says, hey, we're carbon neutral, or we're reducing carbon, recognize that there really is no definition of what they've done. But I would say you're going to have to be involved. Farmers will have to be involved proactively in order to allow activities that they've done in the past, such as planting cover crops. You planted cover crops for the last 5 years. The climate change person that's concerned about that will say no. Others will say, well, you're doing it, so we may as well pay you for it.
Great, thanks for that explanation. Several of your carbon market examples highlighted programs intended for crop farmers, and you also mentioned that forest landowners would have options available for them. What options would livestock producers have available in terms of being compensated for the work that they do to capture carbon?
So the one that actually they can get right now, if they were to go to California, and that is, you could cover your manure system, your manure pit, capture the methane that is coming off of that, and then you can just get very creative. You can just burn the methane off, and you've actually created a carbon dioxide credit. Actually create it for every ton you burn off, you get 24 credits. Or you can create electricity, and that helps your farm costs go down. Or what's happening right now is they will purify it and put it into renewable natural gas, stick it in a pipeline that's going to transportation, and they get RIM for it, RIM. So they get credit for it in other ways, in addition to a reduced carbon credit. So for livestock, the most likely way to generate it, and perhaps the easiest way, meaning most likely way for all of agriculture, will be livestock manure capture of methane. It's very measurable. It's an outcome based rather than a process based measure. And that's what the environmental community wants. They want the outcome based, not the process based methods.
Sure. One of the risk management questions you shared earlier mentioned potential differences in how owned and rented land would be treated. So in cases when you do have rented land subject to a carbon contract, how would the landowner and the tenant share in the cost and payments that were connected to that carbon contract?
Again, that's a kind of a complicated question, but let me see if I can simplify it a little bit. The idea of a carbon payment is to help you adopt a process that you would not normally adopt. So let's say cover crops are just too expensive, but if you got paid an extra $20 an acre, then they're not too expensive. So at this point, the farmer is the one that is paying for the cover crops, not the landowner. And so he would say, the landowner, you don't get any money for this because I'm the one that's paying for all the cover crop expense. But there could be activities in which the landowner comes and says, I want you to do this, and we will share in the cost and the benefits both. But at this point, most likely it is the tenant farmer that's incurring all the cost and will ask to get all the benefits. And by the way, real quick, there are benefits other than carbon sequestration. So if you use cover crops or no-till, you actually are building up the quality of the soil beneath it. And so the landowner should be happy, but the tenant most likely is the one that wants the income from it because they've incurred the expense of it.
Sure. We have time for one more question. If a landowner or a farmer wants to begin participating in the carbon marketplace, then what do you recommend as a first step?
The first step is really study whether or not you want to. I've talked with hundreds of farmers probably in the last year about this. And I know of only one that has actually entered into a carbon market contract. They just say, it's too uncertain. So you have to study before you do it. In Missouri, ESMC is one that's been, I guess, entered into agreements with MFA, with Mo's soy, with Missouri soybean or Missouri corn. And so you probably can get some of your best information from MFA, Missouri corn, and Missouri soybean, because they have begun to work closely with ESMC, which is one of the markets I talked about earlier.
Great. Well, thank you, Ray, for presenting today. It's time to close today's webinar. Thank you to our audience for joining us. When you exit Zoom, you'll see a post-webinar survey will load in your browser. If you'd please consider responding, we'll use the results to improve the webinar experience and also brainstorm future webinar topics. Again, you should receive a recorded copy of today's webinar via your email within about a day from now. Our next Engaging for Missouri webinar is scheduled for Wednesday, October 13th to celebrate Co-op Month. Dr. Carrie Jacobs, who's an Associate Professor of Agricultural and Applied Economics, the MFA Chair of Agribusiness, and a Gickel Fellow, will speak about the strategies agricultural cooperatives use to grow emerging models focused on enhancing value. Again, thanks for joining us and have a great Wednesday. Thanks again, Ray.
Thank you. Goodbye.